My name's Chris Hood. I'll be your host for today's session. I'm one of the global sales managers at Webtrends Optimize, where I've spent the past year helping businesses experiment and personalize to improve their digital performance, working with our all-in-one tool for experimentation and personalization. But for those who know me, my journey in the CRO space goes on a lot longer than that and a lot deeper. I've worked in the industry for the last 6 years. The privilege of working with some leaders in digital experience analytics like SessionCam and Glassbox. Now, in this work, I've noticed, and if you're running a business online or work with clients who do, you've probably noticed the same trend as well, essentially, is acquisition costs are rising fast, and that's putting pressure on margins. In today's landscape, it's not just about actually getting that traffic, it's about making every click count, essentially. And that's why that post-click experience, what your users see and do after they land on your site, is more important than ever. And optimizing this part of journey can be the real difference between talking about wasted ad spend and actual real measurable ROI. So to dive into this topic, I'm excited to be joined by a true expert in this space, founder, chief strategist over at Smart Panda Labs, Shamir Duverseau. Shamir brings a wealth of experience across multiple industries, and today he's here to share some practical insights on how to deliver that end-to-end optimized journey. So breaking it down, we'll be covering how to ensure you're targeting the right audience from the outset, strategies to optimize that post-click experience, what we're calling PCX, to maximize your ad spend. We're going to be looking at psychology and the power of buyer psychology to improve those digital experiences and drive conversions. And we'll be looking at a proven framework for that success as well, looking at relevance, orientation, and stimulation. And finally, once we've got that traffic, once we've converted them, how do we build that lasting customer relationship so you're not constantly paying for that next transaction, and how you're doing really well with your retention? Now, if you've got any burning questions during the session, you can post them. You'll see at the top of your screen next to the bit we're talking about earlier, where you can change your view to be seeing the speaker only, to look at the Q&A section. There's a discussion facility in there, and there is also the ability to post questions, which we'll have some time for in the end if there are any burning issues. But we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump in and start turning some of those ad clicks into some real business growth. So, Shamir, let's start at the beginning of that journey. And making sure you're targeting the right people in the first place. And this is where those specialists in paid media, that's where they play that crucial role, whether we're looking at PPC, paid social, another channel. You're laying the foundation here. Getting this part right helps set you up well for everything that follows. But it's got harder, hasn't it? And more importantly, it's got more expensive as well.
Yeah, 100%. Really, this comes down to the challenge of getting good, solid research, really understanding who that ideal customer is for the business. And as a general rule, as you mentioned, advertisers have gotten really good about doing this, about doing that upfront work and research. I think sometimes we get caught up in a pattern of doing research, maybe creating some personas or creating an ICP, setting up advertising based on that, and then kind of moving on and forgetting about it. We're real proponents of having a cadence to research. So making sure that there's things happening maybe daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, so that you're getting a constant flow of research data, understanding how the market is perhaps shifting or changing, how sentiments are shifting or changing. So via that cadence of research, you're getting two really important things consistently. You're getting a picture of who is coming to the site, who's interacting, who's purchasing, doing things like post-purchase surveys where you get that snippet and that picture of Why did you buy today? Getting some information demographically, perhaps even psychographically about who they are. But you're also getting the what in terms of the whys behind the decisions they're making, how they made those decisions, maybe what other options they looked at. And again, when it comes to those high cadence touch points around research, you're not looking to ask 20 questions or 50 questions at this point. You're looking to kind of get in, ask maybe 3 or 5 questions, and kind of get out. But if you're doing that on a consistent basis, whether that's serving up feedback opportunities on the website, again, maybe a post-purchase survey is another great opportunity to do that. Of course, looking at analytics for doing research, especially experience analytics, those things will be giving you that cadence that will really kind of educate you on who is it that we should be targeting, who in the marketplace is really interacting with us, and who's making the decision to buy, and how do we get more people that look like them via our advertising efforts.
Now, I spoke to someone in the paid media space last week, and apart from him tearing his hair out about, what Meta's saying about AI, and look, we're going to do it all for you, and you don't have to worry about paid media people, but also with things like GDPR and CCPA, we talk about that targeting, but in certain markets, that is becoming more difficult, and businesses are having to sort of cast the net out wider. There's also always this argument between brand and targeted when you're building that paid media as well. What are you seeing from your clients specifically? What you've seen with them on paid acquisition, and what's been their particular pain points around that?
Yeah, it's definitely been rising costs, and it's been the importance and the challenge, I should say, of justifying those costs, right? So of having to go to finance and justify those increased spends. And that's where the balance between what happens pre-click with the advertising cost and what happens post-click is really important, because you've got to find a way to not become dependent upon that paid media like a drug. Because if you become that dependent upon them, what we're seeing is clients, they're seeing their costs go up, but they feel like they have no choice. They feel like they're powerless because they're kind of addicted to this spend. When it comes to privacy, Metas, the Googles of the world, obviously they're trying to adapt and change to that as best they can. It's in their vested interest to make adaptations and change to that, to see how there's better ways for them to use first party, second party data to be able to target people. And as you mentioned, depending on the market, things are a bit tighter and stricter in the European market, not as much so in the North American market. So there's a little bit more play there. But of course, we still see things changing. But it's really about saying, how do we make that click as high a quality as possible? That way, however much that click costs, that dollar spent for that click, we're stretching that dollar or that euro as far as possible to get the most out of it, because we have to pay another dollar, and then it's going to be three, and then it's going to be four. So how do we stretch that as much as possible? And that's what we're seeing our clients having to embrace right now, is having to embrace the reality of, we can't keep kind of pouring money into this, nor can we continue to justify that. So we've got to find another way to drive additional value, and that really comes to that post-click experience.
And as you say, depending on the market, these tools, and there's plenty of experts out there who can get a really good target for, once you know that audience that you want to go for, actually going out and finding that audience. But it's that next step where that massive disconnect is. You've got your paid acquisition strategy. It's the now what? Because in an ideal world, the traffic can convert itself, but it doesn't. You could put the best traffic in front of it, and you could still struggle to make sales. So what is that next step? Because there's a big disconnect there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really why we call it the post-click experience, right? Because advertising is really about getting the click, and ultimately you want that click to drive to a sale. But there's a huge amount of space between the time they click on the ad and the time they actually make that purchase, that they enter their credit card information and they click, okay, I want to actually buy and make this purchase. And as marketers, we have historically spent a lot of time and a lot of money on what happens on the advertising front, and not nearly as much time or money on what happens after someone ends up clicking. And that's really a disservice. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think advertising, relatively speaking, is easy. It's easy to solve a problem by simply saying, we're just going to drive more spend, drive more people through the funnel, and then eventually more people will come through the other end. And that mathematically ends up being true. Of course, you quickly reach a point of diminishing returns with that. But nonetheless, that's one way to look at it. The other thing is, relatively speaking, it's easy in the sense that once you start to think about the experience after the click, when someone hits the website, they hit the landing page, that experience becomes more complicated. It becomes harder to be able to really optimize and improve because you've got this alignment now of marketing and what they're trying to do, of IT, of product, digital product. And you need all those things to be in perfect alignment, kind of singing the same song in order to impact that experience because you're talking about development and functionality and what happens in the checkout process and what can we change and what can we not change. And that can become intimidating. It can become overwhelming. And it becomes a lot easier to say, look, we'll just drive more people through the funnel because I can't afford to spend my time and energy trying to figure out how we're going to fix this experience post-click, how we're going to make this website better. And obviously, there are ways to do that. That's why we're here. But I think that's the challenge, and that's why we marketers often end up defaulting to spending more time and more money, therefore, on that advertising pre-click experience, as opposed to saying, how do we experiment? How do we personalize? How do we improve what happens after that click?
I mean, and you see a lot of this kind of behavior and helping people to fix that disconnect. What are most people getting wrong here? Because it feels like we've been talking about this for years, for eons. I mean, certainly as long as I've been in the space, we've been talking about this disconnect, and we've talked about why some of the time it goes wrong. What's the kind of thing that you see a lot of the time happening, the kind of examples of where that disconnect happens?
It all kind of starts with being, or maybe more accurately say, not being as people driven as we should, kind of being people centric. And by saying that, I mean literally putting ourselves in the shoe of the shopper. Um, and we think about it from a physical brick and mortar standpoint. You're on your way home from work. You need to stop by the grocery store. You need to pick up some milk. It's just something that you need to grab and pick up. Think about how frustrating it would be to walk in the store, you have full intention of getting the milk, and there was no signs in the aisles to say, this is where all these products are. You've never been in this grocery store before, and now you have to go searching for it. And at this point, you're tired and you just want to get home. Like you don't want to have to deal with this. Or maybe even you're familiar with the grocery store. You go, you grab the milk, you get to check out. Only two lanes are open. They're both like 15 people deep. Self-checkout's broken. And now you're like, you know what? Like, I'm not even dealing with this. You put the milk or whatever product, cereal, whatever you're trying to grab, you put on the shelf and you walk out and you say, I'll just deal with this another time. Well, that same physical experience is exactly what people do on the website, right? They get there with this expectation of wanting to take this action. And often that expectation is set up by the ad, but then they get to the website and it's not delivering. So oftentimes we'll click on a paid ad and the paid ad will say, 20% off for first-time customers. And you click on that and there's nowhere where it says anything about 20% off for first-time customers. Well, now you're causing frustration. It's like, again, there's no signs to say, where can I get what I'm looking for? That was what drew me in. And people they abandon. They end up bouncing against that experience. People just get dropped off on the homepage very often, which is a bit daunting for most people when you're trying to shop for something specific, because usually those keywords, those ads, they're often promoting a particular product, a particular service, maybe a category that people are looking for. And now you're dropping me off on the homepage and you're just assuming I'm going to figure out where to go and what to do. And we tend to put a lot of weight on the people to just figure it out. We just assume they're going to figure it out because our site is very easy to navigate, that it's intuitive. And often in cases, it's not. And even if it was, why would you want someone to have to do more work than they have to do? So that's another one we often see. And then probably the third big one we see is just a lack of investment in usability and in functionality. Just having things very clearly structured, having good architecture to the site, good navigation, having functionality that help people find what they're looking for, a good search function, or maybe a tool that help them select a product or service. Those things to help answer their questions, to help get past those uncertainties, those fears, those doubts they tend to have. Those are probably the big three things we see: that the disconnect from the ad, just being dropped off on something like the homepage with no direction on where to go, and then just a lack of investment and focus on usability and functionality.
And to touch upon one of those pieces that you talked about, you talked
Mhm.
about the customer centricity
Yep.
was one of the main things that you talked about at the top there, and it goes to what I've spoken to you before about the big psychological element to this. It's not just the numbers. Now, I know that a lot of people on this call, myself, I'm from a numbers background. I'm a data background. But there's this element of getting into the shoes and getting into the mind of your customers, and not necessarily in the GA4 in the spreadsheet as well.
Yeah, I think we forget these are real people, and people are driven by emotion, and we tend to justify those emotions later after the fact. And purchases are no different. We even high consideration purchases, which is where we spend a lot of our time. There's still emotion there, right? There's the uncertainty, there's the fear that we kind of alluded to and talked about a little bit earlier. Those are real emotions, and you need to get people comfortable. You need to get them confident. You need to get them trusting. Those are, again, emotions that we're playing on. So it's the psychology of the person that's really coming into play. And depending on exactly your product or service, where they are in their journey, that psychology rather, is having a major impact on where they're going and what they're doing and the decisions they aren't making as they go through that process. Which is why today we're going to just talk about some of those psychological levers, right? What are those psychological levers that people are interacting with? How can we adapt to some of those levers? How can we pull them in the right way to help people get past that uncertainty, past that friction, and really move forward in the process?
And exactly, because most of us on this call didn't study psychology at college. It sounds daunting to say. Look, we've done our analytics training, we've done our CXL courses, we know all about CRO, we know all about analytics. Don't tell me I'm going to have to go for 3 years to university to study psychology. So help us out here. We want a framework. We love a framework to say, how do we deliver that really great post-click experience that converts? What are the main things in that framework that we need to consider?
Yeah, I mean, there's many frameworks out there. One that we particularly like was developed by Andre Maurice. He really talked about levels of conversion. So you think about it as a kind of a hierarchy of needs, and that's the same thing that kind of happens when we're going through the purchase process. We have this hierarchy of needs. We start with relevance. That's really important. We move on to trust, to orientation, stimulation, and there's other kind of levels as well as we kind of move down and ultimately get to that point of confirmation, right? Of finally making that ultimate decision. So what that framework is really doing is it's boiling down a whole bunch of psychological principles and bringing them into play. So it's incorporating work from Daniel Kahneman and the work that he did with System 1 and System 2 in terms of the kind of the quick decision making of the brain and the slower, more analytical part of the brain. The work of Cialdini, the work that he did with influence. So those different levers of influence of things like social proof, authority, a liking, right? So kind of taking all those principles into play and just saying, okay, let's now look at this through the lens of psychology and say, the first question we ask ourselves is there relevance with this experience? Then we ask ourselves, is it a trusting experience? Then we ask ourselves, can people orient themselves? And we kind of just go through this checklist essentially to make sure that we're addressing these psychological needs that help move people through conversion.
Well, let's dive into each of those in
Mhm.
turn. The relevance is the first one. How do we create that relevant experience for someone?
Yeah, so one of the examples we talked about of something that we see very readily is when someone clicks on that ad that makes a promise, and then the landing page, the entry point to the site doesn't deliver on that promise. That's relevance. Relevance is, am I in the right place? Why am I here? Is this making sense that I even made this click in the first place? Because people aren't kind of making clicks by accident, right? They're not just like willy-nilly, just like randomly clicking around. There was something about your ad copy and your paid ad, your ad visual, the messaging. There was something that said, okay, I'm going to click on this. So the minute the person makes that choice, there's some expectation that they have that the reason for that choice is going to be delivered upon when I get to that page. And that's what relevance is about. It's saying, okay, now that I'm here, is this relevant to the reason, the message, the product, the promotion, whatever that caused me to click on that ad? And that's what they're immediately looking for, is that area of relevance. So it can be as simple as using the same copy and the same imagery, the same headline that you're using in the ad, repeating it on the landing page. Because if that's what drew the click, then seeing that same image, seeing that same copy is immediately a checkbox to the person of saying, I am in the right place. This is the relevant place because I clicked on something that said, save 20% for first customers. I get there and I see 20% for first customers. I saw a picture of a beach in Hawaii. I get back to the landing page, I see a picture of the same beach in Hawaii. Great. I'm in the right place. I feel comfortable. That's really what relevance is about.
So let's look at this a little bit technically, because it's all fine to say that this kind of point, and you touched upon one of the big no-nos of what's happening a lot of the time is we're getting the ad right, but we're sending people to the generic homepage. So how would you look to do this? Are you looking to send people to bespoke landing pages? Are you looking to personalize a general landing page? I'm guessing there's a certain amount, if you're sending them someone to a bespoke landing page, there's a certain amount of split testing in there or A/B testing. How are you doing this, and how are you getting it right for the relevance point?
Yeah, a lot of this is going to depend on the processes and systems that people have in place in their organizations, how much control they have, how much they're working with their development folks and their engineering folks in terms of their ability to impact those experiences, whether that's via content management. But we'll kind of go from kind of the simplest way to do it, even though it's most labor intensive, to probably the more complicated way to do it, which is probably the kind of the smoothest and most efficient, so to speak, right? So the simplest way to do it is to have a landing page, and it's to have multiple landing pages based on the different kind of ad groups that you're going to. I mean, ideally you'd have one for every single ad, but that's probably not realistic, right? But even having it, if you can aggregate your ads into groupings, right, that speak about a particular promotion, a particular product, a particular service, whatever the case is, and have a landing page that speaks to every one of those groups, every one of those categories, then that's ultimately going to be the easiest way to do it, because then you can just stand up content, stand up landing pages. A lot of people can just do that themselves in their CMS. They have a template that they have. They can go in, put in the content, drop in their imagery, push it live. They're ready to go. Or there's a relatively straightforward process in their organization to say, hey, I need a new landing page. I need this kind of content. I need this kind of imagery. Be able to push that. So now you're dealing with maybe multiple landing pages, but you still have landing pages that speak to those different ad groupings that you're driving people to. The next thing we often see is maybe people are driving persons straight to like a PDP, a product detail page. So in that case, what you'd want to do is maybe leverage that existing product detail page, but perhaps provide some level of personalization based on the ad they're coming from. And often, in this case, the query string is your best friend. So people are already tracking their ads. They have query strings on there, UTM parameters if they're using Google, other kind of campaign IDs using other kind of analytics tools rather. So leveraging those IDs and what they're telling you about the ad or the ad group that people clicked on, they can then target off those IDs and then adjust the experience in the PDP. So they can use a tool like a Webtrends Optimize. Perhaps they have some proprietary systems in their wheelhouse that are able to do that. Other tools, of course, as well. And they can kind of customize that PDP a bit, where they, again, can match some of the copy, perhaps match some of the imagery to what people were seeing in the ad to make sure that people are feeling like, okay, this is relevant, I'm in the right place. And then the third is maybe having a landing page structure and a template, but having that landing page change dynamically based, again, on those query string parameters, where different elements are pulling in based on what you know about the ad that the person kind of clicked on. So again, all those are feasible, all those are possible. It's just a matter of kind of what's available to you in the short term versus what's available to you in the long term. But fortunately, with the advent of tools like Webtrends Optimize, like Optimize, like other tools in the marketplace, you're able to do a lot of those things relatively straightforwardly and be able to adapt those experiences, leveraging those query string parameters to tell you this is the ad or ad group that these people came from.
Your query string is your friend, as
Yep.
you said,
Mhm.
that, and that's something that I talk around with a lot of people when they're talking about personalization, because people think personalization, they think big engines, big data warehouses. These are the starting points, because it's there already. As you say, you're tracking it already. Let's use that and let's create a relevant experience off the back of that. So we've done relevance.
Yep.
What about orientation and friction? I know friction is a word that I know from a lot of my time in sort of session replay and things like that. What about that step, that part of the framework?
Yeah, so we talked about the grocery store example, right? So you drive up to the store, you see you're at the grocery store, you're familiar with the brand, the place. This is relevant. This makes sense to me. Okay, great. I walk in. All right, like where am I and where's what I'm looking for? So orientation is about the labels on the aisles, right? It's about saying this is where cereal is, this is where the bread is, this is where the eggs are, this is where the milk is, right? This is where the ice cream is, right? Orientation is saying, okay, like where am I now, and how do I find what I'm looking for in a very easy way? Oh, okay, I see there's labels here. Now I'm oriented to that. Those labels will guide me down to those aisles. Better yet, especially in larger stores, you get to the aisle and maybe there's labels down the aisle that say, okay, now here's the section for the cereal and here's the section for the snacks or whatever the case is. I'm further oriented, right? And I'm saying, okay, now I need to go down halfway down the aisle to get to the cereal I want. So all those things that really provide that direction as to what to do and where to go on the page from a UX standpoint, we're talking about usability here. That's orientation. That's kind of letting you know where you go and what you should do. That's removing the friction from the process so I can very easily navigate to where I need to go and I'm not having the frustration. Because again, just like in the physical experience, every moment you don't have that sign, every moment you have to look around and go up and down a couple of aisles, or you need to ask someone, you've felt it. You get just a little bit more frustrated. Every minute you're spending doing that and you're not sure of what's happening, that frustration level is increasing. So the whole purpose here of orientation is how do we reduce that friction? How do we reduce that frustration as much as possible and make sure people feel like they're being pointed in the right direction?
And then you've got usability issues as well within that. I mean, we've all been to websites where not necessarily something's broken, but the process feels a little bit, I don't know. I mean, friction is the right word. It's not complete. There's small annoyances there that build up to be the big annoyances, and that's where you're going to be looking at your experience analytics. It's where you're going to
Yeah.
be creating and testing hypotheses as well. So, talk us through what sort of thing on the experience analytics
Yeah.
area.
So
First of all, what are we looking at, and then how do we turn that into a hypothesis?
certainly, yeah. So we've seen issues with clients, for example, where you get to a PDP, and at the point of the PDP, you want someone to do essentially one thing. You want them to add to cart. That's your primary goal. You want them to add something to their cart. So let's keep focused on that action. So again, you might think it's very straightforward as to where to go and what to do and for people to add to the cart, but sometimes you get blind to your own issues. And we had one client where their add to cart was at the bottom of the page, and the nature of their site it caused a couple of problems. The color that they used for the add to cart was a color that was used very heavily on their site, so it kind of got lost in the page. And then once more, their cookie opt-in banner, when you got to the page, if you entered on that page, the banner would pop up right over that add to cart call to action. So we saw people just not adding things to their cart. We dug into the experience analytics. We did some journey analysis to kind of understand the path people were taking. But we also really looked at kind of the click map and the heat map. Where were people scrolling? How far down were they going? Where were they clicking on the page? And we saw just people weren't interacting with this add to cart. So by looking at those analytics, then looking at some session recordings to see, okay, what are people actually doing, and seeing them literally just kind of go past it as if it's not even there, we were able to identify the issue. So now we were able to come up with some hypotheses that we could test. And make no mistake about it, this is not going to be necessarily that you're going to find this this special easy button. We're going to do this one thing that's going to fix it. There's been plenty of instances where we had to do a few tests to really solve the problem. With one client I'm thinking of, we did some things where we kind of moved it around and moved the experience and so forth. Didn't really have an impact. What we ended up doing was actually just changing the color of it. And I'm not saying change the color of buttons and that's a test necessarily, but in this particular case, it made sense. It created enough contrast that it drew the eye, that people were able to see that this was a different color that isn't as commonly used on the site, which made it stand out more. It gave it a little bit more mental real estate. And now that area of friction was reduced. People knew where to go and what to do. And we saw increases now in add to cart and subsequently in purchase at the end. Um, so leveraging those analytics, you're able to come up with those hypotheses. You're able to begin to test different scenarios and see what ends up best impacting your audience. Because we've seen it time and again. We'll do something with one client, even a client in the same industry, and it works great. Then we'll try that same test with another client and in the same industry, and it is a disaster. It doesn't work at all. But it teaches us something about the impact that portion of the experience has and it leads us in a different direction to keep learning. And then ultimately we kind of see, okay, this is how we improve that experience and reduce that friction and better orient people to the experience.
Okay, so we've oriented our customer, we've removed a lot of the barriers to their particular journey, we've had something that's relevant. Really interested in this third strand. So stimulation, what's that all about? Because we don't often hear that when we talk about, we know relevance, we know friction. What's stimulation all about?
So stimulation is about now give me a reason to buy, right? So what's the value here? What's the proposition? So you get this the sea of choice. So let's go back to our grocery store example. Maybe we're going to pick up some cereal. Well, as you know, there's a whole lot of cereals, right? So what makes me choose one cereal over the other versus perhaps even just getting frustrated and being like, I don't know what the kids are going to like, or I don't know what my wife's going to want. I don't want to get in trouble and get the wrong thing. So I'm just not getting anything. I'll just figure it out later when they're with me. And maybe you don't come back at all, right? So stimulation is about what's going to get me to end up buying, and it's the information on the box that says this is nutritious. You know, 9 out of 10 doctors love this and recommend it, or whatever other crazy stuff that we marketers put on that. But it's what draws the eye and says, okay, now I have a reason to buy this. Yeah, my wife said she wanted me to buy something healthy for the kids. This thing says it's healthy, has 50% less sugar, whatever the case is. I'm going to get this one, right? It has stimulated me to take action because I see the value in what's happening. So we take that to the web. The same thing, what's stimulating me to get past that uncertainty that I have at this point is this the right product? Should I get this product? Should I not get this product? So social proof is a great example. It's a great psychological lever because it's basically saying, if other people like this, then that probably means I'm going to like it. And as simple as that sounds, research shows that is a powerful psychological trigger to people. When people feel like, okay, other people are doing this, it very, very quickly gets people more comfortable in saying, I should therefore do this too. And we've seen this in A/B tests. We've done this with high consideration purchases with clients with multiple products, and people were just having a hard time choosing and selecting which product. We added some social proof. We flagged certain products as being popular based on a particular parameter. Immediately, we saw conversions go up because it gave people something to say, oh, okay, this is why I should make this choice. It alleviated that uncertainty that we have that we carry into making decisions. So another one, especially in retail that we see a lot, is something as simple as a return policy. There's an uncertainty of like, what happens if I buy this and I don't like it, it doesn't work out. Understanding and making the return policy more shallow, communicating what that is and what that process is, again, stimulates me because it removes that level of uncertainty. It lets me know, okay, if I do this, it's super easy to return. They're going to send me the same bag. I stick it back. It's prepaid. I put it back in the mail. It goes back very easily. So those are all those kinds of ways that we can, from a website standpoint, use that stimulation principle, that particular level of hierarchy, and get people further down that conversion funnel.
And actually, I mean, you've got that example around the cereal example. Things that I find perform really, really well is what I tend to think of USP banners. So, looking at a cereal box, for example, you often have that, and you talked about the 50% less sugar,
Mm-hmm.
folic acid,
Yep.
all of these kind of things that when you're looking at that sea of things, immediately attract your eye. And I've often thought, and I see some websites do this really well, and some
Mm-hmm.
websites where these key details are hidden. When you talk about things like returns, a
Mm-hmm.
USP bar, just as
Yep.
soon as someone gets on the site, they know when they're going to get something, they know they're going to be able to return it, they know why they're buying through you. And again, to use the term orientation again, you orient them to your value proposition as well. So people
Mm-hmm.
aren't having to hunt out this data, they've got that reason to buy from you as well. So I often find they perform really, really well.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing is these are all things that you can try, and you don't have to like 100% buy in and assume it's just going to work, right? You're able to test and you're able to understand what impact is or is this not having on the experience of people adding to cart, of people checking out, of people ultimately purchasing, right? So you're able to measurably see, okay, this is working. Because it may be that you inject social proof, but maybe you haven't injected it in a way that your audience is responsive to social proof. Or maybe you haven't given them the kind of social proof that they want. So are they satisfied with X number of people looked at this thing, or do they want to see how many people bought this thing in the last week, right? So different audiences, different triggers, you're able to kind of experiment and tweak, but at least the psychology of it is a starting point to doing that. And then you go back to what we talked about earlier, the research that we've done on these people and that we're doing upfront is really pointing us in the right direction because we're asking them, what made you buy? And someone says, well, I saw this was very popular. Someone says, well, it was important for me to see the return policy that I could easily return it. Well, now they're telling you these are these triggers, and now that's directly informing your test. And the data shows when tests are based on research, they are much more likely to produce winning variations than when they're not. So when you combine that research, understanding the underlying psychological principle that people are essentially communicating to you, because that's what they're telling you. They're telling you what was the psychology that moved me. You apply that psychological principle, you're going to get a higher percentage of winning variations, and you'll see what's really impacting your kind of customer.
Right. So we've looked at getting the customer to the site in the first place.
Yep.
We've hopefully converted them using that framework that we've talked about. But we don't want to go through that process again every single time. We don't want to pay because it impacts your margin if every single time I have to pay to get a new customer
Yep.
in. So we want that customer to come back on their own. And we start to build that lifetime value. Retention is a massive topic at the moment, and it's connected with this rise in acquisition costs. How can we retain and build lifetime value, and that CAC versus lifetime value topic?
Yep.
And we also want, if possible, to bring someone back who we got them to the site. They didn't buy this time, but can we get them back to buy next time? Can we get a second bite at the cherry? So how do we do that? How do we retain and get that second shot with people?
Yeah, so this is where like email, right, really comes into play very well as an important tool. And I say email, there's a couple different ways to use it. You can use it as a baseball bat, or you can use it as a scalpel, right? So as you go through the purchase process, maybe someone ends up opting in to receive emails from you. They do this, they make their purchase, and all of a sudden you start sending them emails every day, every other day. You're throwing promotions at them, but you're not treating them like the person who just came and bought X products from you, which you're forgetting the fact that you know something about this person already. They have explicitly and implicitly given you some semblance of information about them, but you're ignoring that and you're just throwing promotions at them. And then you're wondering why they're not necessarily responding to your emails or why you have to throw promotions at them to get them to come back and end up buying, as opposed to saying, hey, let's look at this as more of a scalpel. Let's use this more surgically and say, how are we now feeding off of the information that we have about them based on their purchase and maybe recommending another purchase because we've seen a pattern. We've seen people who buy X tend to buy Y, or people who buy X tend to be interested in other products in a particular category, and then leading back and saying, hey, let's lead off with this particular product or this particular recommendation or this category of products, which our data is telling us a person like this is more likely to respond to. So if you're not leveraging and continuing that relationship using email as a means by which to do that, you're really missing the boat, right? You're not continuing the conversation in a way that allows you to build a relationship with the person. And now they have a reason to come back to you and they don't have to click on another ad, right? They can click on the email. Or even if the email is just keeping your brand top of mind, they come right back to the website and you're doing personalization based on their past visit or their past purchase to help drive them again further down that conversion funnel. All of that is playing off that initial spend, that initial ad dollar that first got them exposed to your brand and first got them into the funnel. So this idea of confirmation once someone buys, of making someone feel good about their purchase, of making them feel good about this relationship they started with you, and therefore wanting to continue that relationship.
So it's what you talk about is primary and secondary CTAs, isn't it? I mean, if we
Mhm.
can't get them to buy, we're going to try to do some way to get them to at least get on an email list. How would you sort of do that? What's your thought? Because we all see you get to a website in the first place and they go, hey, sign up to our mailing list the first time you
Mhm.
hit, and it's really not the best way to do it. So how do you kind of look at getting that secondary one if we can't get them to buy in that first visit?
Yeah, I'd say the first way, if you're not doing it already, is definitely cart abandon, right? So during the purchase process, how are we able to capture that email information um, at some point in the purchase process before they actually get to the actual point of conversion and confirmation, and then leveraging that to say, hey, we saw that you left this in your cart, and starting to communicate with them again. Then, as you do that and you capture this information, now you're able to kind of extend that, and you're able to do things like browse abandon or search abandon. So maybe they even haven't even gotten that deep in the funnel. But the other thing we've had great success with is positioning, as you mentioned, positioning email as a secondary call to action. And again, this is great when it comes to high consideration products, where the primary call to action is perhaps on the PDP, add something to your cart, but the secondary is, hey, get a little more information, learn about this, learn about updates to this product or service, allow us to share information about this product or service with you. And now that secondary call to action, which doesn't require as much stimulation because there's not as much of an emotional load on you, right? There's not as much uncertainty about giving your email address as there is about giving your credit card and actually making the purchase. Now we've got you, we can send you these triggered communications, and we've seen great success. We've seen multiple clients where those triggered communications based on these people telling us they're specifically interested in this product or whatever the case is, they're driving more revenue than any of the ad hocs that they're sending, any of those promotional things they're sending, without even having to offer a discount, because now you're communicating back to them based on what they already told you they're interested in. So just simply making that one connection is driving additional revenue. And again, you're extending that ad dollar, right? You've got them. We can't get them to do target number one. Let's get them to do a priority target number two, which is to get their email and then to smartly build that relationship so that we can get them back and make sure that that ad dollar is paying off and driving a return on ad spend.
And then it's just repeating the cycle again, isn't it? Because we talked about that acquisition cycle. There's the same argument for email. It's that relevance, orientation, and friction and stimulation all over again. We're not just sending someone to a certain point. We're it's a constant loop, isn't it, of looking at that hierarchy of needs again.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And we've only explored like three, right, of those level of the hierarchies. Like there's other levels. We didn't talk about trust, which is really that second level. There's other things that can be done, and all those things are things that can be optimized across the web experience or the app experience or across the email experience or any combination of those things. And there's always room for improvement, right? We're talking about a framework here of where to get started, right? Of ideas to say, this is where we start with these things, but as we start with those ideas, as we start learning and getting more data and information, then we can begin to iterate, and it becomes this flywheel that ends up feeding itself. And you're really rolling with us this roadmap of ideas that's just continuously driving, and it's adapting and changing and evolving based on how your customers are changing and the market's changing, competitors are changing. So that changes how we position relevance, right? How we stimulate our customers, how we properly orient them. So it's got to be this ongoing process, but you got to start. And the simplest way to start is to take some of these very basic principles, to lay them down, to see how do we apply these principles in a very simple way? How do we test them and validate that these things are working for our customer in the way that we're presenting them, and then move forward and keep going in that process.
Well, Shamir, thank you so much for that fascinating deep dive into the post-click experience, how brands can maximize their ad spend, get that retention. Before we wrap up, tell us a little bit more about Smart Panda Labs. What kind of work are you doing, and how can people get in touch if they want to learn more, or they like what they hear and they want to work with you on that hierarchy?
Yeah, I mean, of course, feel free to follow me, reach out on LinkedIn. You probably won't find another Shamir Duverseau on LinkedIn, so you'll probably have a pretty safe bet of if you search for my name, that'll be me that you find. Smart Panda Labs, we focus, as we mentioned, on that post-click experience. We focus on helping brands to really refine that experience, both from a marketing and a technical standpoint, so that we can drive not just that initial conversion, but also that lifetime value across that conversion. And we really focus on helping people get started, right? Really that crawl, walk approach of saying, how do we get started and moving things forward? There's just so many things that go into developing the kind of experience that people come to expect today. We help brands really define what those 20 steps are, and they get started. Step one, step two, step three, moving down that funnel, especially for those high consideration purchases.
and it's been great working with you and seeing some of the work that you've done with some of our shared clients as well, and where you're pushing the platform and Webtrends Optimize and a lot of things that we do as well. So look, if you're looking to improve the post-click experience, get more ROI from your ad spend, don't forget to reach out to Shamir and Smart Panda Labs. As I mentioned, they're a trusted partner of ourselves at Webtrends Optimize. If you'd like to learn more about us at Webtrends Optimize, you can head over to webtrends-optimize.com. That's optimize with a Z. You can connect with me over at LinkedIn. Feel free to drop me an email, chris.hood@webtrends-optimize.com. If it's your first dealing with us as Webtrends Optimize, we're the experimentation and personalization platform. We've been in the business for around about 25 years, and we're famous for having no tiers and no limits, as well as a superior customer support. So we're really talking enterprise level capability without the enterprise level price tag. And plus, if you have seen with us before, we've just completing a full UI overhaul of the product. It's getting amazing feedback from our beta users as well. So take this opportunity to come and take another look. Thanks again, though, for tuning in. Thank you to Shamir. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend today, and look forward to catching you next time.
Thank you so much, Chris.